Good evening, Pu, Vero, and friends. So today I would like to present the article, one chapter summary of the article from K 2006, Assessing Young Language Learner from Cambridge University Press, entitled Assessing Oral Language. As we can see from the title, it's talk about oral language. As we know that language consists of two, divided into two, oral language or written language. So we will talk most about oral language. And at the preface, the assessment of oral language is challenging process because of the combination of speaking and listening activities that may be involved. Sometimes more speaking than listening, as in the news telling, for example. But sometimes it's also combination of both. So there are equal between speaking and listening, like in the conversations, but sometimes also more listening than speaking, as in the teacher-led class discussions. And then oral works not only leads to new learnings, as a techniques of revision, it also reinforces the initial learnings and prevents it from slipping away. And then oral language assessment is often avoided in external testing because of practical considerations. So some people said that oral language assessment is not practical, not very complex, and it's not practical. Yet oral language makes up the core of young language learners curriculum. And then in our discussions today, we will talk about the kind of oral language expectation that young foreign and second language learners encounter at school, the relationship between spoken and written language, the scope of oral language to be assessed, the issues surrounding in oral language assessment, the types of assessment taught in speaking and listening, assessing vocabulary and grammar in oral language. We go first on the oral language at school. So there are two contexts here. The first is the foreign language learners context. So in foreign language context, children learning oral language in formal school setting learns best by communicating primarily through oral language. Effective programs give children early opportunities for practice of routine language and basic language patterns, but also for imaginative play, action rhymes and songs, response to narrative text, and participation in narrative and simple descriptions. And it is different from the second language context. So most children in the second language context or situations are engaged in primarily oral learning activities in the early years of the school, but many will also be engaged in the serious business of learning how to read and write at the same time. So the opportunity for foreign language learners is it's more effective program will give most benefit to the children. The relationship between spoken and written language. So as we know that there are two kind of language, there are oral or spoken and written language. The feature of language used in each activity depend on the purpose, the audience, the norms and expectation of the context. So this is the base theory of language written by Weikel 2002. So to know the difference between spoken and written language, we can see the theory from mood continuum that illustrate how language use differ according to the context and the nature of the cognitive demands on the child. So the mode itself in the continuum refers to the channel of language use which can be spoken or written. As you can see from the feature 6.1, the mode continuum by Derevianka 1992, there are two kinds of language. In the left side, it is spoken language, and in the right side, it is written language. So, in a spoken language, there are face-to-face interactions, and also language accompanying experience, and also the actions. And in the written language is non-interactive monologue and reflections, and also it's based on the language constructing experience. So before we consider the tests of oral language for children, we have to understand more about the nature of oral language itself. So the children use oral language either in conversations or in extended talk. Conversations usually involve unplanned speech and are more casual in nature. In the other hand, extended talk usually involves planned speech and is more formal. So now we have to underline what conversations and extended talk. The difference is very clear here. Conversation is casual and unplanned. In the other side, extended talk is more formal and planned speech. In conversation, speakers are supported by feedback from interlocutors or other speakers through notes, smiles, response, and by the kinds of response. For example, follow-up questions, incorporations, exclamations, and so on. In wider classroom interactions, children's opportunities for participation depend on the nature of classroom interactions that is set up by the teachers. So this is the challenge we face together. Because conversation is dialogic in nature, people take turn finish off each other's utterance and build on each other ideas. So this is the nature of oral language. And spoken language often has incomplete sentence, non-specific words, and may contain relatively little information in any given chunk or language. This is because speech is made of idea units. What is idea units? It is the short phrase that and or clauses connected with and or but or that or not, joined by conjunctions at all, but simply spoken next to each other, which possibly a short pause between them. So this is the difference between spoken and written language. Written language is more plain, so uh, usually it is complete sentence, but in spoken language, it's often or has an incomplete sentence. The ability to use language for conversation interactions and oral presentations is not necessarily present in young learners. The complexity of oral language assessment of young learners is compounded by these maturational factors. Children may not participate because they do not yet have the cognitive and social skills that are needed. So we go to the other side of the discussions, the scope of oral language to be assessed in young learners programs. The scope of oral language to be assessed might be determined by a curriculum but may also be determined through standard or tests which may or may not be aligned with the curriculum. So we have to look for the curriculum first. If the curriculum is already done, we follow the curriculum, but if it is not ready, we can make it. The scope of oral language assessment depends on the purpose for the assessment, whether it is internal or external assessment, and whether it is for learning or accountability purposes. The curriculum may be written as goals and objectives or as outcomes. The curriculum may set out a list of genres. A curriculum may also contain a list of functions. Functions are written as categories of behaviors, for example, in expressing thanks and gratitude, and so on. Grammar and vocabulary to be covered may also be listed as part of the curriculum covering oral language. In some situations, I underline here, in some situations where no curriculum exists, classroom teachers decide what should be assessed. So this is the difference between provided curriculum or non-provided curriculum. A framework for oral language ability as a theoretical construct. So language knowledge here or language ability here consists of two. They are organization knowledge and pragmatic knowledge. Organizational knowledge consists of two also. There are grammatical knowledge and textual knowledge. In the other side, pragmatic knowledge consists of functional knowledge and sociolinguistic knowledge. This is adapted from Bachman and Palmer's 1966. So, what is in the organizational knowledge? There are grammatical knowledge. So, grammatical knowledge from the children is children knowledge of vocabulary, syntax, and phonology needs to grow and deepen. And the textual knowledge for children need to be increasingly able to speak in ways that are cohesive as well organized. And functional knowledge for children's ability to use language for many different functions needs to grow. And then the social linguistic knowledge for children need to learn to use oral language appropriate to the language use situation that are in. So there are some knowledge that children have to know. Contributing knowledge and skills. So curricula that are language use oriented usually also list the contributing knowledge and skill that children need to learn. Teacher and assessors need to take account of the goals, objective or outcomes, and the range of contributing knowledge and abilities in a curriculum, if it is exists, and assess students' oral language skill accordingly. So, for example, ability to discriminate sounds, stress, and intonations. Ability to recognize the stress in words and in connected speech. Ability to recognize difference in the use of intonations. And the second example here is knowledge of a growing range of vocabulary. Ability to use and understand a growing range of vocabulary in their oral language. Issues in the assessment of the oral language of young learners. So there are some issues surrounding the assessment of oral language for young learners. The first issue is selecting oral language assessment tasks. So before we select oral language assessment tasks, we need to consider some factors need to be considered here. The first one is the motivations. The second one is determining the appropriateness and usefulness of oral language assessment tasks, and other dimension of oral language tasks that influence performance of the children. And therefore, the selection of tasks is, for example, the topic of the interactions, the level of formality, if it is informal, consultative, or formal, the number of the participants, the relative status of the participants, it is high or low, low or high, or just equal. The familiarity of the participant with each other, the gender of the participant, it also have to be considered. And the last one is the use of written tests. So I will continue about the use of written text here. The use of written text as a basis for an oral assessment task should be avoided until literacy skills are known to be secure. So as we know that children have their own maturity of literacy skills. So we have to make sure our children have literacy skills before we give them a written text. Opportunities to assess oral language use in the classroom might not be available. So oral interactions of young learners is often assessed informally through teacher observation in the classroom. Opportunities for assessment of oral language will not automatically be available in the classroom. Assessing pronunciations. Teachers and assessors need to be concerned with the articulation of words and longer stretches of language in discourse rather than isolations. Assessing vocabulary. There are another issues instead of assessing pronunciations, assessing vocabulary. Also the issues vocabulary can be assessed both through a child oral language use and through literacy tasks. Assessor will be checking that children have the vocabulary they need to understand and use language for a range of purpose in a range of different contexts. Vocabulary can be assessed constantly and informally during the teaching and learning process. Criteria sheets or holistic rating skills that assess overall quality of performance, one aspect of which is vocabulary can be used. So to assess vocabulary, there are criteria sheets and or holistic rating scales will be very useful in this kind of assessment. Assessing grammar. Assessment of grammar for young learners or children begin in oral language and continues in more focused way in writing tasks only as children language ability expand. So as we know that in written language grammar is more important than in spoken language. But here assessment of grammar for young learners begin in oral language. We have to look at the grammar also in the oral language. Young learners' grammar can be assessed in oral language through observations involving analysis of children's oral language as they engage in meaningful language use activities. So, how teachers can assess their children's grammar, its base can be from the observations. And then we go to the another part of the discussions today. So classroom assessment of oral language. So we can use observations. This is the central tool for assessment of oral language in the classroom. In the table 6.3 here, we can see the example of observations, big book activity with opportunities for oral language observations. You can see the activity here, and then in the classroom, oral language assessment often occurs as a part of a cycle of teaching process. So observation of oral language can be take place in the first. So teacher calls children to math, and in the third group question on the book, and also in the fourth children draw pictures, and in the fifth second group reading of book, and the last is in the sixth children draw and describe their character. So except number 2, teachers can observe their children's oral speaking based on this activity. So this is some kind of guidelines for observing oral language proposed by McKee 1999. So the first we have to select the situations. Points to remember: do not despair if the children says nothing. Keep observing as much as you can during the observation period and observe interactions. As we know that children is very different from adult learners, so sometimes they have a good mood or they have a bad mood, so do not despair if the child says nothing. Observe your own behaviors. Be aware of how much knowledge of the home language the teacher has to assist the child in order to keep the interaction successful. The procedure: choose 2 or 3 children to be observed. Focus on each child for a period. So we are it is useful guidelines because we are very hard to observe all of the children in one class, but we can divide it into some days. So in one meeting or in 1 hour we can choose 2 or 3 or 4 maybe children to observe each day, not all the children at the same time. Classroom assessment of oral language. For example, like in oral records in portfolios. So oral records in portfolios can be collected by teachers as a means of closer analysis of performance and a record of progress. So teachers have to have their own oral records in portfolios. Assessment during teacher-students interactions, and then self-assessment. Self-assessment strategies help children to monitor their progress by themselves. So there are some types of oral language assessment tasks for young learners. Tasks involving speaking only. So it is divided into tasks involving speaking only, or maybe assessing listening only, or selecting listening only tasks, or something like that. So we go back to the task involving speaking only. We can choose some types of oral language assessment here, like news telling, storytelling, picture talks, categorization tasks, oral presentation, or other speaking only genres. If we choose tasks involving both speaking and listening, we have question and answer tasks, oral interview, mini dialogue oral plays, oral information gap tasks, or partner and group discussions. So it depends on our needs whether we need to test our student speaking only, or we want to test the both speaking and listening. This is kind of the activity that can be used as the guidelines. Assessing listening only. There are many situations in which listening needs to be assessed explicitly, especially in school learning contexts where listening plays an important role, not just in language learning, but in learning itself. A child's listening ability is strongly influenced by the nature of the spoken texts that are being encountered, and spoken texts vary according to the purpose, topic, and context. Listening is more difficult to assess than speaking because it is invisible. Yeah, so because it is invisible, so it is difficult to assess and has to be assessed indirectly. Evidence of listening comprehensions can be readily observed in conversations where children's response and participation can be used as evidence of understanding. Selecting listening only tasks. Children need to be prepared for listening tasks. They need to know beforehand why they are listening. Listen to the story and try to find out why the monster ran away. Teachers and assessors should give children every chance to show they have understood. Pictures, simple chart, puppets, and other visual material might be required as a support in assessment tasks for listening comprehension, especially for young learners and less proficient children. Teachers and assessors should avoid using very familiar text because using familiar text will only give an assessment of children's accumulated knowledge of the text in questions, but not of their ability to comprehend new language. You have to know the theory of an input hypothesis, I plus 1, so maybe it is based on the theory. So children have to show their progress, not state. Other skills should not be expected in the children's response unless their other skills are known to be secure enough for the task. Ideas for assessing listening comprehensions, it's taken from Brewster and Ur. Listen and do task requiring action response. So the task here is action task. So the task assessor need to keep in mind that children might be copying each other and check with individual children may be needed. For example, like in the game of Simon Says. Total physical response task, or we know as TPR. This is an action task that involves children in a physical response to a request or command. For example, when we talk about body part, you can direct your student to touch your hair, touch your eyes, touch your nose, like that. Listen and do tasks requiring short language response. So the task can be true or false tasks. Children can be asked to respond physically, for example, by raising a different colored piece of paper for true or false. Oral clues. A written passage is provided with words deleted at regular or irregular intervals. Noting specific information. Children are asked to listen for specific information. What did the mouse do when it showed the elephant? And to know the answer. Grid and charts. Grid are usually rectangles and marked off into square, which children feel is as required. Matching tasks. Children listen to a description of a picture. Which picture is being described? They can point out to the picture. Spot the mistake. Children listen to a familiar story, but there are errors in the story. They need to signal there are mistakes and explain it. So there are kind of tasks in requiring short language response. Listening tasks requiring language responses. There are two kind of tasks can be choose. The first is responding to a series of comprehension questions. So here children listen to a text and answer a series of oral or written comprehension questions, or maybe dictation tasks. So here involve children listening to a text and writing it down as they hear it. Dictation text should be chosen carefully to suit the literacy proficiency level and concentration span of the student. So in the last part of our discussion today, I would like to highlight some important things. Oral language, consisting of speaking and listening in different combination, is the foundation for language learning. So as we know that oral language is the foundation of language learning. The difference are not simply spoken and written. In the final analysis, however, it is the task rather than the skill that will determine the nature of language to be used. The scope of oral language to be assessed depends on the curriculum, which may be influenced by sets of standards. Your understanding of the issues in task selection, including task difficulties, and knowledge of the best ways to assess grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciations in oral language. The assessment of oral language is at the center of language assessment in a young learners program. Oral language provides the foundation for literacy development. So that's all for my presentations today. Thank you for watching. See you.